Good afternoon. My name is Nigel Dower, and I'm really grateful to the Melton Foundation to give me this chance to tell you my story about how I became a global citizen, or at least how I came to recognize I was one anyway. I was born in Yorkshire, in England, in 1942, as part of a middle-class family. I was the eldest of 4 boys up there. And I can say that my parents were very liberal and very globally minded. They wouldn't have called themselves global citizens, but I think I already got the idea of being a global citizen from my early days. Anyway, we lived in a town in Yorkshire called Ilkley. There were some famous rocks called the Cow and the Calf. Some of you may have seen that before. Anyway, I went to school near there, and then I went to university where I studied classics and philosophy. And the next thing I want to mention to you is that I went to Kenya as a VSO student. And some of you may know that phrase, Harambee, which is Swahili for let's pull together. And I think that was a lovely phrase I really caught on to when I was there. Anyway, after I'd gone to Kenya and been there for a year in '64, I then went to do postgraduate work, and then went to the University of Aberdeen in 1967 as a young lecturer, and basically I was there most of the rest of my professional life. And in the early '70s, I got more interested, partly stimulated by being in Kenya, in issues of development and so on. And there were 2 organizations that I got involved in the '70s. One was the United Nations Association UK, and the other one was the Aberdeen World Poverty Association. And it was through those 2 organizations and reading their literature that I became more and more aware of all the interconnected global problems there were to do with the environment, development, human rights, and peace issues. When I was in the Aberdeen World Poverty Association, when I became secretary of it in 1974, the outgoing chairman slapped me on the back and said, "In for a penny, in for a pound." I don't know if you know what that means. It means you're not quite sure how much this is going to commit you to. Well, in point of fact, it was a very big pound, because in a sense that was the start of a whole trajectory of interest in development issues, in world poverty and associated issues. And so it was during that time that I got really interested in these issues. And there was one particular evening class I was teaching, and I was giving a lecture on the environment, and I gave a rather gloomy picture of the state of the environment. This is long before global warming, lots of other problems, like we saw then, and I also gave lots of moral arguments about why we should try and protect it. And somebody in the audience said, "I think I can sum up your position, Nigel. You are a factual pessimist and a moral optimist." And I don't say this autobiographically alone, because it seems to me that this actually captures what I later came to recognize as the attitude of a global citizen. That is, we may be realistic about the state of the world, its problems and challenges we face, but we're a moral optimist. We believe it is possible to make a difference. And if you believe it's possible to make a difference, then you ought to put your oar in and do what you can to make a difference. So I commend that idea to you all as what you may be as well. Maybe factual pessimists, but I hope you're moral optimists. Anyway, during the '70s, I was working in these organizations, apart from my job at the university, and I got more and more interested in trying to write down why I was concerned about the world. And this resulted in a small book called World Poverty, Challenge and Response. It actually came out in 1983, but I was writing it at the end of the '70s and early '80s. And this led to several things of significance. First of all, it led to my being able to go to Zimbabwe for 3 years in 1983 to teach in the university there. And that was, of course, another experience of a developing country and seeing all the problems of poverty and so on. And I gave a public lecture there called "What is Development? A Philosopher's Answer." This seemed to go down quite well, and it indirectly led to my getting involved in an organization called the International Development Ethics Association, IDEA. And this became an organization I was very involved in for about 20 years. I'm still associated with it, but it was where a lot of my work on international issues was done and a lot of my thinking was done. So this was something that was led on from having written this book. And the other thing which it led to is my being asked to teach a course in my university, an advanced course, called Ethics and International Relations. And this was a course that I taught pretty well every year until I retired 8 years ago. And it was a course in which I was able to explore with students all sorts of ethical issues to do with global affairs and international relations. And it was during that period that I came quite clear that the position I wanted to defend was cosmopolitanism. Now, some of you may be unfamiliar with that long word, but actually it's just a fancy Greek word, or two words put together, meaning global citizenship. It means cosmos polites, meaning citizen of the universe or citizen of the world. And so I came to recognize that as what I was really advocating. And cosmopolitanism, to my mind, consists of two main theses. First of all, the thesis that all human beings matter and matter equally. And secondly, we have responsibilities towards one another across boundaries. That is, we, wherever we are responsible, if we can do something relevant to help, responsible to do something about the life conditions of people anywhere in the world. So that was my basic ticket. And during that period, I did a lot of teaching, as I said, in this area, and lots of key ideas were used, and a number of really interesting textbooks. And I just want to mention three of the ideas which I used with students, because I think they illustrate my interest in global ethics and global citizenship. The first one is from someone called Peter Singer. Some of you may have heard of Peter Singer. He's an Australian philosopher who was very interested in animal rights and all sorts of other practical issues. But he wrote a famous article in 1972 in which he argued, and this was in response to a famine in Bengal at the time, he said, "This is a principle I want us to accept. If it's in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought to do it." He gave the illustration of a lecturer passing a pond at the university campus, and there's a child in the pond that's drowning, and the lecturer naturally stops and gets the child out, saves the child. Now, the lecturer, of course, gets his trousers wet and dirty. He's late for his lecture, perhaps. But that's not of any comparable importance to saving the child. So he says, surely we all accept that principle. So if we accept that principle, shouldn't we apply it globally? If we can save a life without sacrificing any comparable importance, we ought to do it. And he argued that that meant the rich in the richer parts of the world ought to devote a lot of their money to help relieve poverty. Now, it's a very controversial principle. I've used it with many, many classes. It provokes very often very lively discussions looking at its strengths and looking at its weaknesses. But it's been a tremendous teaching tool, and I wanted to share it with you. Another one that I use quite a lot was from someone called Henry Shue, an American philosopher, who argued that basic rights are the minimum demand of all humanity on all humanity. And to me, this is a very eloquent way of expressing the whole idea of a global ethic, that there are certain fundamental elements to human well-being, and that we all, as it were, are in principle required to consider how we can meet those minimum standards of human well-being. So I think that's a tremendous saying. I wish I'd said of it first, but I didn't. Anyway, the final one I want to share with you before moving on to another area of my work is Aldo Leopold. Some of you may have heard of him. He's an American ecologist who many years ago, in a famous little book, said, we human beings should think of ourselves not as masters of nature, but as plain members and citizens of the biotic community. And I found this a really inspiring idea. What he's trying to say is that we need to think of ourselves on much more equal footing with the rest of the animal world and plant world and so on, the biotic community. And he was trying to reject what in the West is sometimes called a Cartesian view, which separates human beings from non-humans because human beings are said to have a soul or rationality and animals are not meant to have. But I think that this symbolizes a way of rethinking our relationship to the natural world. And I think that global citizenship isn't just about caring for fellow human beings elsewhere on the planet, it's about caring for all life on the planet. That's controversial perhaps, but I think it's a very important aspect to thinking about global citizenship. Anyway, I want to move on now to a project that I ran from 97 to 99 on global citizenship at my university with various people from throughout Scotland and one or two from England. And we had a series of meetings leading to a conference, a small conference, not a big conference like this one. And as a result of that, two things came out of it, particularly the reader on global citizenship, which I think is still the only reader with many different articles in existence on global citizenship, and my own short book on the introduction to global citizenship. Anyway, in that period, I began to shift my focus of interest quite a bit. I've always been interested in development, environment, and so on, but I began to think more and more about war and peace issues. And I came to think that one of the most important things we must do in the world is to promote the conditions of peace. And this is a view which I've advocated, not pacifism, which is just a view about not killing and not being wrong to kill, but Pacifism, which is a view which says that we can reduce the incidence of war and conflict, and therefore we have a duty to do it anywhere in the world. It's called Pacifism. Anyway, I've been promoting that in latter years in one way or another, but I wanted to share with you two particular ideas which I think are particularly important to promoting the conditions of peace, and I think would commend themselves to anyone who took global citizenship seriously. About 1988, I was in the Quaker headquarters in London, because I'm a Quaker. I'll say a bit more about it in a moment. And I saw this saying, which is taken from Gandhi, the means are the ends in the making. Now, to say the means are the ends in the making is to say, in my opinion, that we always ought to make our means consistent with the ends we're pursuing. We ought to, for instance, pursue peace peacefully. We ought to pursue justice by just means. We ought to promote human rights by respecting human rights in the process. And I think it's a very powerful moral idea, which if more and more people adopted, we'd have greater peace in the world. And so I'd like to commend that to you. But more particularly, I want to tell you about an experience in Argentina. Now you might think, what's that got to do with Argentina? I was at a big conference in 1994 in Buenos Aires, and I was a rapporteur on a workshop in which a Christian geneticist said we ought to respect nature because it was created by God. And immediately after him, a Buddhist philosopher said we ought to respect nature in just the same way, precisely because it was not created. Okay? And suddenly I had this intellectual frisson. Good heavens, here are two people supporting the same values, respecting nature, but for different reasons, for different beliefs, worldviews. And so I wrote down on that piece of paper, and I've used it many times to illustrate my thesis, the shared values are the middle lines in the middle. The worldviews are the different worldviews, each support shared values. And on the other side, there are diverse expressions of those. And many years later, at a workshop in Estonia, a student, having heard my views, decided to use it for his presentation, and he decided to call it the cat's whiskers theory of ethics. That's my cat. Okay, so but seriously, I do think one of the most important ways to greater peace is for us to accept what we have in common by way of shared values or priorities, but accept that we might have different reasons, religious or non-religious, for so doing. Finally, I just want to say a little about where I come from. I started off in my young years more as a humanist. I just thought we ought to be decent towards fellow human beings. As time went on, I became a Quaker, joining in 1980. Quakerism is a small religious movement. It's all over the world, but mainly in English-speaking countries. It started in the north of England in the 17th century. It was one of these many protest movements against ritual orthodoxy, the hierarchy of priests. We have no hierarchy of priests. We have a very simple form of worship. But our main idea is that we think we should answer that of God in every person. That's our catchphrase, if you like. Answering God in every person. Answering that of God by attending to their material needs. Answering that of God by respecting their views and life journeys. So that to me is very important. But my favorite quotation is from William Penn. As some of you will know, he's the founder of Pennsylvania. And he said about 200 years ago, he said, "True godliness doesn't turn us out of the world, but excites our endeavors to mend it." And I've always liked the idea of mending or repairing things. Ever since, when I was a child, my father used to make toys and mend toys like that one on the screen for you. I've still got that toy. I mended it for my children. I mend it for my grandchild. She plays with it. So to me, mending or repairing things isn't just a practical act, it's a way we relate to the world. And I love the idea of mending the world. Here's a broken world for you. What are we going to do to mend it? That's the challenge. And the thing that I feel as global citizens, we should recognize that in trying to mend the world, we're not just doing it as a duty, a rather tiresome duty. We're doing it with joy, as a positive affirmation of our fellow humanity. That, to me, is the key message. Once, a long time ago, I gave a lecture on global citizenship, and I was told by someone in the audience, look, you don't need to talk about global citizenship, Nigel. You can just talk about moral agents with a global sense of global responsibility. Why do you need all this extra baggage of global citizenship? It just messes things up. I said, no, it doesn't. It says something very important and extra. And one of the things it does is that it says more that we have duties towards one another in the world. We actually belong to a global community. We have a sense of belonging to it, and that's important to us. And let's hope we can have a united, mended world to be part of. Thank you very much.